kind of like that song that was popular for a while. I don't get around much anymore. I had a problem. I mentioned it a while ago, and I'm not completely sure that I solved it. But generically, I was supposed to talk to you about why people came to Texas. My guess is every one of you's got a slightly different reason for being here tonight, so we can't, lump everything together. And I've come to the conclusion that no matter where anyone goes, they go for one or a combination of three reasons. One, either they want to go and find something that they don't have and they want. Two, they want to go to get away from something that they do have and they don't want. Or three, somebody tells them to go. And almost everything you can lump into those same categories. And then I got to thinking about, why do people come to Texas? And I actually tried to present this program several weeks ago. It didn't work too well because I realized that I was creating a blivet. Now some of you, I suspect, know what a blivet is. The blivet is 10 pounds of anything in a 5-pound sack. And so you just can't put that much in a small sack. And so I decided to break it down. I'm going to give you one part of the story tonight. If you like it, call me back, I'll give you another part of the story. If you like that, call me back, I'll give you another part of the story along the way. Why do people come to Texas? Well, in the beginning, and of course in the beginning, that's a long time ago, like you said about archaeologists finding something new every day, so to speak, almost every day we push back the dates of human occupation of Texas. When I was in school, and actually when I first started teaching, it was holy writ that no one was here before about 12,500 years ago. They've pushed that back to around 30,000 years now. And my guess is it's going to go back farther than that. We can't go back that far. I don't know about those people very much, but we're learning about them as time goes by. What I'm going to have to try to start with, though, is the beginning of the European influence here in Texas at a time when Texas was far more heavily populated than today we think it was. The best estimates of the archaeologists and the sociologists and a whole bunch of other different ologists is that in the year 1500, the total population of what is today Mexico and the American Southwest, 50 million people. And 30 million of those live basically in the Central Valley of Mexico. Well, that kind of leaves 20 million to be divided between Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California. I don't know how you want to divide it. Let's just do it evenly and say 5 million. Hey, that was the population we had here in Texas in the census of 1930. 5 million people. There were a lot of folks here. We don't know much about them. We do have, on the record, over 900 different tribal names that were recorded here in Texas. We know that's not accurate because we know how they got those names. They would go to one group and say, "What do you call yourselves?" "We're the Upas." "What do you call those folks that live on the other side of the river?" Go to the other side of the river. "What do you call yourself?" Pretty soon you've got 4 names for 2 different peoples. Anyway, but we're talking about a lot more humanity here in 1500 than most folks realize, and that is kind of what you could say is the canvas on which we're going to try to superimpose a new picture. But to do that, we've got to go back a little bit too. We've actually got to go back to a little pre-story in the early 1400s. I'll try to make this relatively painless, but in the early 1400s, Portugal got its political act together almost before anyone else in Europe did. Portugal's a relatively small nation. It's surrounded by mountains and the ocean. Once you got a handle on it, you can kind of hold on to that handle. And so Portugal got its act together before Spain did. And in the early 1400s, the illegitimate son of the Portuguese king, one of the illegitimate sons of the Portuguese king, realizing that he could not inherit the crown and not really wanting to create any problems but wanting to better himself, collected a crew and a small ship and sailed down to what today we call Morocco in North Africa, and came back loaded with gold, silver, and slaves. Wow, hey, that's money. Prior to this, the biggest economy that Portugal had was fish, and actually sardines. That was their mainstay of their economy. Now suddenly there's something else. And then they did it again, and they did it again, and a few more folks got interested and they did it again. And every time they came back, they brought back riches that were unknown in Portugal, or for that matter, anywhere on the Iberian Peninsula. Portugal was Roman Catholic. A large chunk of the profits of these expeditions went directly to the church. So much so that in the mid-1400s, the Pope granted Portugal a monopoly on trade with Africa. Nobody else could trade with Africa except Portugal, under threat of excommunication, being burned as a heretic, because the Pope said you couldn't. Ooh, great. Okay. And Portugal got richer and richer and richer, and Prince Henry set up a school, and we call him in the history books Prince Henry the Navigator. And at this school they turned out ship's captains and navigators, and he would send them out with the orders, don't come back until you have gone farther than anyone else has gone and brought back a map. And in leapfrog steps, Portugal began its trip down the west coast of Africa, ultimately in time passed around the Cape, ultimately in time ended up in Japan. I mean, this was the beginning of the big Portuguese Empire. 1492. Christopher Columbus, who may or may not have been Italian, as he claimed to be, Apparently he didn't speak Italian. But in any event, he approached the King of Portugal with this idea: the earth is round. If you sail 400 miles west from Lisbon, you're going to end up in downtown Yokohama. And I'll bring back tea, and I'll bring back lacquer work, and all that kind of great stuff. And King of Portugal says, why? I can't build ships fast enough for the trade that I've got with Africa. Go away. And so Columbus took his idea to Ferdinand and Isabella, who had just married, and for the first time had created what ultimately became a unified Spain. Now we've got to go a little bit back on Ferdinand and Isabella. Spain had been involved for 700 years in what was ultimately the only successful crusade of our history. They call it the Reconquista, the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, which had been ruled for 700 years by the Islamic Caliphate. And it took a long time. It took them 700 years to do it. And part of that time was lost because all of the ones who were trying to do this were also fighting amongst each other, because each one wanted to be the biggest dog in the pile. Well, they finally began to get things together, and Ferdinand married Isabella, and that united for the first time two kingdoms, kind of a Romeo and Juliet sort of a deal, but united two kingdoms and began the unification of Spain. But Spain was broke. Now, they had a problem. And unfortunately, this was a problem sort of created by the church. Because a while back, the church realized there was a problem. There were several major religions that all claimed the same taproot, but didn't agree with each other, had different leaves, shall we say. Judaism was the oldest. Then came Christianity. Then came a split in the Christian church between Eastern Orthodox and Western Orthodox. And then came Islam. All of those are based on the same deal that God made with Abram somewhere in the desert west of the Chaldean capital city of Ur, that said, you are my chosen people, because all of them trace themselves back to Abram, children of Abraham. They recognize the same prophets, they recognize the same story of the creation, they recognize, hey, it's only modern times that they begin to get different. One of the things that they all agree on is what we call the Mosaic Law. Some of us call it the Ten Commandments. Now, I don't know how long it's been since you read your Ten Commandments, but somewhere in there, you know, it tells you, thou shalt not kill. It doesn't say thou shalt kill only on alternate Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. It says thou shalt not kill. And the implication is thou shalt not kill humans. Because in other places, God gives humankind dominion over all other life forms. Thou shalt not kill. How can you then justify, say, the last 2,000 years of trying to exterminate each other? Thou shalt not kill. Actually, it's very simple. And they all did the same thing to a greater or lesser extent. They simply redefined humanity. If you do not believe, as we believe, you're not human, you're not entitled to the rights and privileges of humanity, you can be folded, spindled, mutilated, and have the tags ripped right off your mattresses, and it doesn't matter because you're not human. You can be enslaved. You can't enslave humans, but you can enslave non-humans. Now, the Albigensian rebellion in southern France caused the church to create something called the Office of the Holy Inquisition. The Albigensian rebellion in southern France was based on a group that denied the infallibility of the Pope. And the Office of the Holy Inquisition was designed to root out this heresy and destroy it. And they did a pretty good job there in southern France. A phrase that you heard a lot fairly recently actually came from that time period. One of the Christian generals had surrounded this small town there in southern France, sent word to the Pope, we've got them surrounded, what do we do with them? And the Pope said, kill them all. Pope Innocent III, incidentally. And the general objected. He said, but within the walls of the city are many of the true faith. And Innocent III said, kill them all, God will find his own. Kill them all, let God sort them out. You've heard that before. So anyway, that pretty well worked there in southern France, and they did such a good job that the Office of the Holy Inquisition really didn't have much of anything left to do. Now comes the Spanish Reconquista. For some 700 years, Spain had been ruled by several different dynasties coming out of Islam. And at that time, they got along quite well with the Jews. There were lots of Islamists and lots of Jews in Spain. They had castles, they had libraries, they had hot and cold running water, they had things that nobody else in Europe had at the time. But you see, they're not human. What do you do with them?
Kill them.
And so basically they were given three options. One, convert to Roman Catholicism. If you do that, you keep your life, you keep the property that you own, you keep everything that you've built over 700 some odd years. All you have to do is change your name and become a communing member of the Roman Catholic Church. You become a converso, one who has converted. Option number two, if you don't want to give up your faith and you have the money to do it, you can buy your way out. You give everything that you possess to the coalition of church and crown, and you can leave with what you can carry on your back. You've got your life, you've got your faith, and you don't have a home anymore. And anyway, option number 3. You don't want to convert. You can't buy your way out. If you have a marketable skill, you become a slave. If you don't have a marketable skill, this of course is the 4th option, which is no option at all. That's extermination. Hitler didn't invent that idea of a solution to the Jewish problem. It's been around for a long time. So it's within this context that Columbus goes to Ferdinand and Isabella and says, well, I got this neat idea. And they say, go for it, take off. And the idea that Isabella pawned her jewelry to outfit the expedition is pure hogwash. But what she did do was point the royal finger at 3 communities and said, you will provide a ship and a captain and a crew. Royal edict. Columbus lucked out because in that dragnet, he picked up 2 brothers as ship's captains who had actually attended Prince Henry's school. And he became the captain of one of the 3 vessels, and the 2 brothers became the captains of the other 2. Personally, his navigational skills were probably about on par with mine, because spherical geometry is not my thing. Straight geometry I can kind of do, no. And I don't know that Columbus could have found himself with both hands without the help of these other 2 guys. But in any event, they sailed, and it's interesting to note that one of the first entries in the Columbus log, as they're leaving port, is a reference to shiploads of these who have not converted, who are escaping, leaving, getting out of Dodge ahead of the game. So Columbus sails the Ocean Blue, 1492, comes back. He found an island, he found 2 islands. He didn't know where they were. He thought he had found the East Indies. It was just a jump from Japan. Of course he wasn't. But when he got back, and he had brought back half a dozen monkeys and a few kidnapped Indians that he had picked up on the islands, and some brightly colored birds and such as that. When he got back, he didn't sail back to Spain. He sailed to Portugal. That's where the 2 captains knew where to go. And he went back to the Portuguese king. He says, I did it, I found it. Yeah. What, are you still here? I thought we got rid of you. Only then does he sail back to Spain. They roll out the red carpet, literally, declare him Lord Admiral of the Ocean Sea, and finally we get to something that's important. 1492, Columbus sails the Ocean Blue. 1493, the Pope divided the world. It's called the Papal Line of Demarcation. You can look it up, and even on globes and maps you usually find it. It's been shifted several times as they've recalculated exactly where it goes. Roughly it's the 40th degree of west longitude today. And what it said was everything east of that line belongs Portugal. Everything west of that line belongs to Spain. We don't know what's there, but it belongs to Spain. Now this 40th degree west longitude starts, of course, at the North Pole, comes down the middle of the North Atlantic, cuts off the eastern corner of South America before going back out into the South Atlantic and onto the South Pole. That's why, for instance, Brazil was a Portuguese crown colony, and why they still speak Portuguese there rather than Spanish. It was a Portuguese crown colony up until the beginning of the 20th century. But anyway, this divided the world under threat of excommunication, of being deemed a heretic. Now the rush is on, and there's something, again, that you need to understand about the Spanish system. All of the expeditions and all of the land are the property of the crown. Each expedition must be authorized by the crown. Beyond that point, the crown doesn't pay a dime to outfit the expedition. The expedition becomes sort of a joint stock venture. You buy your way into the expedition. There's several ways you can do that. You can buy your way in with money. You can buy your way in with goods. You can buy your way in with services, or any combination thereof. And so the subsequent, for instance, Columbus voyages and all the other Spanish voyages that set out, are things that are bought and paid for by stockholders in that expedition. And in the end, if you make a profit, you get out of it in proportion to how much you put in proportion. That's the way it works. You got to keep that in your mind, especially the idea that it must be authorized by the crown. Now, and even that created a problem, because they realized that one of the problems in the Reconquista there in Spain was that, well, once they had reconquered, say, one little province, and they moved on to another, it was like pulling your finger up out of the water and putting it down somewhere else. And it filled in right behind you. Until they realized, and it took them several hundred years to realize this, that before you can leave one particular place, you got to leave somebody there to control it. And so they appointed what was called a governor viceroy, a governor in place of the king, had all of the authorities of the king within that province, as long as he could do two things: keep the peace, make it pay. If you couldn't do one of those, or either of them, there are plenty of people standing in line wanting that job. Well, that worked pretty well there in Spain, where these provinces are right next to each other. Here in the New World, instead of provinces, they had islands. Some islands are big, some islands are little. Some islands are Hispaniola and Cuba size. Some islands are little bitty tiny islands. Each one gets a governor viceroy with the authority of the king. That means that each one of those governors viceroy has the authority to authorize further exploration. And in that respect, it works kind of like one of these multi-level marketing schemes, like Amway or some of that, if you authorize enough different expeditions, sooner or later one of them is going to find something of value, and that value is going to trickle through you before it goes back to Spain, And the more of these folks you can have doing that, you know, the richer you get. And so you try to send out as many as, anyway, you can see there's going to be a problem there. Fast forward. 1519. We didn't go too far forward. But 1519, a fellow by the name of Hernan Cortez, who was of a lower middle class noble converso family in Spain, arrived in Cuba and was appointed as the alcalde, the mayor, the chief justice, whatever, of one of the communities on the island of Cuba there. And he wanted to better himself. And so he proposed to the governor that he be allowed to take an expedition, find something. And I've read several things about different things, about how and why he and the governor ended up not getting along with each other. But initially the expedition was authorized, and he started putting it together, and then at the last minute the governor pulled out the royal permission for the expedition. Cortez said basically, and before he was quite ready, set out on the expedition anyway, which caused the governor to issue orders for his arrest. But 1519, Cortez sails west, hits the coast of Mexico, about where Veracruz is, and begins the conquest of the Aztec Empire. And at the same time, because he chooses, I'm trying to think of a delicate way to say this, I can't. He chooses as his interpreter an Indian girl who was a slave within the people that were right there on the coast. And she is known as Donna Marina. They have a son, and this is the beginning of really well, it's recognized, whether it is or not, but it's the recognized beginning of the mestizo or mixed race people of Mexico. That son of Cortez and Marina. Anyhow, Cortez got very rich, but he died broke. Things caught up with him. And yet Spain prospered tremendously because they don't have any competition. Nobody can go there. It's not going to be until Henry VIII throws out the Pope and declares himself head of the church, and then you start having the Protestant Reformation up in Germany, that other European nations are going to say, we want a piece of the pie too. Portugal and Spain have got their foot in the door. So we're going to have expeditions after expedition after expedition. So far we haven't talked about Texas. The first time we run into anything that deals with Texas is Alvar Núñez. No, I take that back. It's Alonso de Pineda. Alonso de Pineda is sent out by the governor of Jamaica to find the Straits of Anion, which don't exist, a water passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And in the process of searching for the Straits of Anion, he goes around in one direction and then goes back around the coast of the Gulf of Mexico and creates the first map that we have of Texas, or at least the Texas coast. It's fairly accurate. His longitude is off because they don't have a good way to determine longitude, but otherwise it's fairly accurate. And whether or not he spent any time on shore, he's the one, for instance, who gives Corpus Christi Bay its name, Matagorda Bay its name, et cetera, et cetera. And we think, although we can't say for sure, that he careened his ships to scrape the bottoms on the backside of Padre Island at the mouth of the Rio Grande. There are others that say it was the River Panuco down in Mexico. I'm not going to weigh in on that. But in any event, we have for the first time a map of the Texas coast. Then comes, followed by the name of Panfilo de Narvaez. Panfilo de Narvaez never made it to Texas. He had been one of Cortez's lieutenants who had rebelled against Cortez, had ended up in a good old grade B movie sword fight with Cortez, lost one of his eyes in the process, and instead of killing him, when Pineda came by making his map, Cortez just banished the followers of this fellow, and somehow in the process, Panfilo de Narvaez made a copy of the Pineda map. Cortez had found great riches. Pizarro, down in South America, had found great riches. Lots of gold. God doesn't make an unbalanced universe. If you've got this much gold in South America and this much gold and equidistant in North America, where does it stand to reason you're going to find equal amounts down here and up here? And Narvaez thinks he knows where it is because he's got the map. His expedition sets out, lands on the west coast of Florida. He has really bad judgment. The Grand Cacique, the Indians there, recognizing that, hey, this is an important somebody who's come to visit, sends 300 musicians to lead a grand parade of Narvaez and all of his people to the Grand Cacique's headquarters, which is about where Disney World is today. Narvaez slaughtered them. Maybe he didn't like Indian flute music, I don't know. But from that point on, no Spaniard went behind a bush for any reason in return. They literally had to fight their way up the west coast of Florida. And losing men, they ate all their horses, things were looking bad. Up in the elbow of the peninsula, up around Panama, no, not the far west of Panama City, but up in the elbow of the peninsula, they decided, well, this map really doesn't show the Gulf to be all that wide. It's kind of long, but not all that. They can just build some little boats and float around the edge of it. And so they built a little batch of boats. I don't know how they built them. We don't have a good record. Only that they tried to cover them with the hides of the horses. They didn't make it. And Narvaez apparently died in the process. But there were castaways on the Texas coast, among which is Alvar Núñez. Now we call him Cabeza de Vaca. It's not his name. Alvar-Núñez is his name. Cabeza de Vaca is a royal title that had been granted to the family. If you know your Spanish, you know what cabeza de vaca means, head of a cow. Hey, that's the head of a cow. And how are your horns? No. But his name is Alvar-Núñez, who had been the treasurer of the expedition. And amongst the ultimate survivors, of which there are only 4 ultimately, is also a Moorish Berber from North Africa by the name of Estevanico. And they survived, but Estevanico, because he was Moorish and a Berber, he was Islamic, he had not converted, he was a slave. When they're finally picked up, these few survivors, on the west coast of Mexico, down around where Culiacan is, after traveling for about 6 years across South Texas and northern Mexico, there are only 2 people that they're interested in. Cabeza de Vaca, he can read and write. He can tell us what's there. Estevanico is a slave. He still has value. The other 2 just disappear out of the story. But we have Cabeza de Vaca. Well, anyway, Cabeza de Vaca, Alvar-Núñez, interesting chap. They say, we know what you were looking for. You were looking for a lot of gold up there. Where did you find it? I didn't find any. That's the most dirt poor bunch of Indians you ever saw in your life up there. There's nothing up there of value. Well, wouldn't you like to write a true account of what you found? Yeah, okay. So he writes his first relation of his trip across it and turns it in. They read it. Yeah, but you forgot to put in here where all the gold and silver is. I told you there isn't any. Well, back in prison. Wouldn't you like to write a true account? It took him 4. There are actually 5 of these relations, supposedly of the same trip, and they don't agree. The last one, he says, we didn't find any gold and silver, but we heard about it. Why didn't you say so in the first place? Yeah, come on and put on some clothes, have a glass of wine, tell us all about it. He's got a little time to come up with a good story. And boy, he comes up with a dilly. But it's not a new story. The story that Alvar-Núñez tells is possibly the oldest lost treasure story in world history. The first time we run into this is in cuneiform and clay tablets from the Sumerian Empire. And according to that, somewhere up there are 7 golden cities where people live in golden houses, ride in golden chariots on golden streets, and eat off of golden plates, and then throw them away so they don't have to wash them. And that story keeps recurring in world history about every 500-600 years. First it's up there, somewhere north of the Caspian Sea. Next time you hear of it, it's over somewhere in India. Next time it's over beyond the Great Wall in China. During the so-called Dark Ages, the Crusades, it was pretty much an article of faith in England, at least, that these golden cities were in Africa and were ruled over by a Christian king by the name of Prester John. But they couldn't find them in any of these. Now we know why we never found them. They're not over there, they're over here. Right there, he told us. Alvar Nunez kind of disappears from the story. Next we have a fellow by the name of Fray Marcos de Niza. Fray Marcos de Niza is a lay brother of the Franciscan order. He has worked in South America, he has worked in Central America. He is beginning to get on in years, and I can't help but think that maybe he was absent on the day that they had their meeting and appointed him to be the guy that is the representative of the church to find these golden cities. Because you see, the church put its foot down. It wasn't quite getting the percentage of the profits it thought it should. If anybody's going to claim 7 golden cities, it's going to be the church. It's not going to be the crown. It's going to be the church. Fray Marcos, I don't know anything about golden cities. Oh, don't worry about that. We'll give you a guide. Somebody who's been there, he knows all about it. Estevanico. Estevanico doesn't know anything about it either. Never heard of it. It's not his story. But this is the expedition that sets out into the American Southwest. And in honesty, we don't know where he went. We know he had a rather interesting system. They would set up a base camp. And Estevanico and a batch of tame Indians would go forward and try to find out something about the location of golden cities, while Fray Marcos sat at the base camp and waited. And at least in theory, if Estevanico heard of the golden cities, he was to send a message back to Fray Marcos. And rather than a verbal message or a written message or anything like that, it was to be something that maybe the Indians didn't understand. It was to be a cross made out of twigs. And the relative size of the twigs was to indicate how close Estevanico thought they were coming to these golden cities. And according to Fray Marcos' report, after a few weeks, here out of the heat, haze, and dust devils of the desert comes an Indian boogieing along with a little 6-inch cross made out of twigs. Hot dog, we're on the trail. Pick up the base camp and move forward to where the Indian had received the message, by which time Estevanico had gone on ahead. And in a few weeks, here comes another Indian, a little bit bigger cross. In a few weeks, finally, if you accept what Fray Marcos told him, one day out of the desert, here comes an Indian trudging along with a full-size cross over his shoulder, like the guy that maybe some of you have seen walking down Texas Avenue over in Bryan on Easter. And Fray Marcos knows they've hit the jackpot. They've finally gotten it. And according to him, he says he went to the top of the mountain, and there he saw, shining in the distance, his dream, 7 golden cities of God. And he planted a cross, and he claimed them for the church, and he went back home. Estevanico didn't accompany him. Estevanico, at least in theory, had been killed by these non-humans that were occupying the golden cities. Now the church says the gold is there. The church says it's there. The church doesn't lie. It is there. Enter the next major character. His name's Coronado. Coronado was of a pretty well-to-do family. Coronado's wife was the granddaughter of Montezuma. He was to lead an expedition, and people are flocking to pay their way into the expedition, which is actually two expeditions, one to go by ship up the Gulf of California and go up the Colorado River out there. One of his lieutenants is the first one to give us a written account of the Grand Canyon. The other one is to go overland, and they're to meet up somewhere, wherever these golden cities might happen to be. And, you know, well, they cross into New Mexico, what is today New Mexico, probably about 40 miles west of El Paso, headed northeast, hit the Rio Grande about 40 miles north of El Paso, and then continue up the Rio Grande. And every one of the pueblos they come to along the way, what do you know about Golden City? I don't know any Golden Cities. But you see, that pueblo and everything in it belongs to the crown. And so they strip it and move on and strip the next one until finally winter catches them up in northern New Mexico. And there really the axe falls heaviest on the neck of the Pueblo Indians, because they get thrown out of the Pueblo to house the expedition for the winter. A bunch of them freeze to death, and a bunch of them starve to death. And anyway, in the spring, what's left of the Pueblo fathers appear before Coronado and say, we know what you're looking for. You're looking for these golden cities. By now you pretty well should know we don't have any of those. But we do have among us a slave who comes from the golden cities, and in return for his life he will lead you to them. They called him El Turco because very uncommon in Native Americans of the Southwest. He had a pretty droopy Chu Manfu mustache, El Turco. And in the spring, El Turco led them not east and north, but southeast. They crossed the Sangre de Cristo. They crossed the broad valley of the Pecos River. They climbed the escarpment, and they came out on the Llano Estacado, the high plains, the panhandle of Texas. There's nothing there except a lot of sky, a lot of grass, and it's so featureless that the military, they plant a lance and ride a couple of 100 yards and plant another one, line them up like fence posts so that they can keep going in a straight direction. But no sooner do they start going straight, and El Turco says, oh, this is the place, we need to go this way. So they go off in this direction. Now we need to go this way, now they go in this direction. We have archaeological evidence that they circled around and around in the Texas Panhandle and spent the next winter in Palo Duro Canyon, where Coronado apparently had sort of a one-on-one discussion with El Turco, who admitted he didn't know anything about golden cities. He said that they'd spare his life if he'd take him and lead him up there. He'd done the best he could for that, so Coronado chopped off his head and left about half of his expedition there in Palo Duro Canyon, while he set off farther to the north and east, crossed the Panhandle, crossed Oklahoma, crossed most of Kansas, until up on what's today the northeast corner of Kansas. He ran into the tree line up there on the east side of the Great Plains. And a bunch of dirt poor Indians up there that lived in mud huts They didn't know anything about golden cities. And he was forced to conclude they don't exist. And he had to fight his way back, literally, because they hadn't left any friends behind him. When he got back to Mexico, where did you find the gold? Sorry folks, there's nothing up there. Wow, throw him in prison. The church says it is. Are you arguing with the church? Now you need to tell us where the gold is you're holding out on. And he's going to spend what's left of his life back into in and out of prison. At the same time he's doing this, there's another fellow that had the same idea that Narvaez had. And he sets out on an expedition that lands on the coast of Florida, makes its way straight up through Georgia, past Atlanta, crosses into North Carolina around where Charlotte is today, goes northwest across North Carolina, crosses the Appalachians, comes back down the west side of the Appalachians, fish hooks back up, crosses part of Kentucky, finally comes to the Mississippi River, and he dies. His expedition is taken over by a fellow by the name of Louis Moscoso. Now, up to that point, the expedition had left very good records. Navasota, that's the guy we've been talking about here, left records that you can follow the route they followed with about a 20-mile variation, because he's so exact in physical features and things like that that they pass. Once Moscoso takes over, well, he just didn't keep much in the way of records, and he hated Indians. They buried DeSoto. They put him in a fine sound suit of armor and stuck him in a hollow log and dumped him in the Mississippi River, saying that he had found nothing so glorious as his resting place. And then Moscoso and what's left of the expedition set out across Arkansas, probably came into Texas, somewhere around where Texarkana is, probably crossed the Trinity River somewhere close to where Dallas is, probably hit the Brazos River not far from where Possum Kingdom Lake is today, where he came out on the plains. And there they ran into Indians who told them of the Coronado expedition, which had gone by to their west just about a year before. He figured no reason to go any farther west. If there's anything out there, Coronado's found it. And he turns around and makes his way back. They build some boats on the Mississippi, float down the Mississippi, and what's left of them finally make their way around to the settlements down at Panuco in Mexico. Now, if you've been thinking about this, they haven't found anything. But they have seen every geographic province we've got in Texas. They have seen and/or mapped the coastal plain. They have seen and/or mapped the East Texas piney woods and the cross timbers and the valleys and plains. They've seen and mapped the rivers. They've seen and mapped the high plains, the cap rock. They don't agree. They've all seen different things. They've all seen different Indians. And they do all agree on one thing. There's no reason to go back. There ain't nothing there. This has taken them quite a long time. Taken them over 150 years to come to this decision. it's going to take something of a very compelling nature to make somebody want to go back to come to what is today Texas. Now, I don't have my time.
It's 6:30.
Well, that doesn't mean anything to
Oh,
me.
well, we can stop now if you want to. or
We can stop now if I want to.
Pick up again.
The point is, I told you I had kind of divided this, why do people come to Texas, into different categories. That was the Spanish Entrada. There were other expeditions of exploration. Most of them were short, and such as that. But by that time, there's no reason to go back. There's got to be some other reason other than finding gold and silver for folks to go back. And so the next step would be the attempts to colonize and the reasons for doing that.